Good evening. Let me go straight to my first slide because we are on time, and I will ask you to really get your seatbelts fastened because I have little time and I want to say a lot this evening to introduce the conference and to introduce quite a complex language and the issues surrounding the question of God and who God is and his character. So let me quickly see if this works. It does work. Here comes the question to us. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Perhaps you know when the morning stars sang together. Famous words from the book of Job. And they should make us wary not to prime too much into matters we don't know much about. Yet just recently, NASA has released these images showing when the foundations of the world formed, when the morning stars shouted for joy. This is how it looked. We can go back. We were there, they say. The whole section of Job 38-39 is set up like a warning, saying there are limits to what we can know, how far we can push knowledge, because we're not God. And yet the whole passage in Job 38-39 is also a charge accusing us that we have always been pushing those boundaries. The question of the character of God is a question that is on the same level of peeking into divine sphere as we have in Job. Yet it became the central topic in Christian church since its inception. The very early Christian creeds are a commentary to the deeper question of who God really is. The 4th century Christological and Trinitarian debates and formulations are attempts to form some collective Christian understanding about God, his actions, nature, and character. As we look closer, therefore, into the structure of what became Christian systematic theology, that is a system which attempts to capture the beliefs of the followers of Jesus in a coherent and organized manner, we discover that for Christian systematic theology, the question of God and his character is indeed foundational, despite the warning we have in the book of Job. And the same is true about the Adventist theology, for which who God is introductory to everything else Adventism confesses. Adventist systematic theology in its official form of the 28 fundamental beliefs starts defining the doctrine of God in statements 2, 3, 4, and 5, and also number 8. And we don't have time to go there in detail now. In this presentation, I intend to raise some, not all, but essential questions regarding God and his character. I will first investigate why we talk about God as we do. As Christians, we have our language, notions, descriptions, which we associate with God, with who he is in his nature and character. I will ask where do we have them from and what is the significance and the legacy of the language the church began to use about God. In the second part of the presentation, I will advance the discussion to raise some critical questions about this legacy. And I will also ask where do we go from here. Overall, the main aim of my presentation this evening will be to provide an introduction into the conference theme by providing an overview of the major questions and language surrounding the topic of God and God's character. I hope this will serve as a generic framework for what is coming tomorrow through a wide variety of presentations. So let's go to part 1 straight away, the main questions about God. In the course of Christian history, several key questions concerning God have been raised. The answers to these questions lead to further clarifications and concerning the nature and character of God. You have those questions on the screen now. Does God change? Does God exist in time, and is he omnipresent? Does God know everything? Can God do anything and everything? Is God entirely good? Now, these may look like academic, philosophical, speculative, not interesting questions, but I will try to convince you that these are very important questions. And in fact, already in the prayer Camilla prayed in the introduction, she already answered some of those questions even without knowing. that she answered these questions. So these are the main questions, and these lead to further sub-questions. These are not all the questions concerning the question of the nature and character of God. Now, these clarify, as I said, divine nature, God's actions in the world, but also address the question of God's character. Now, and none of us, as I'm claiming, is immune from the influence of these on our individual and collective Christian thinking about God. Before we introduce them in more detail, it's worth starting by defining some key terms. And I'm sorry, lots of these terms will come your way very fast. But I have to start defining some of these key terms that we will use. The first one is classical theism. Classical theism denotes a summary belief in God who doesn't change, is omnipresent, present everywhere, does know everything, can do everything, is entirely good and exists as Trinity. And some of those positions were just expressed in the introduction. In broad terms, this has become the essence of the Christian doctrine of God. However, really only in broad terms, because classical theism functions like an umbrella term. It is therefore necessary to recognize that while most of the Christians, in broad terms, speak about God in these terms, as I mentioned to you, the term also has some subdivisions to it. So classical theism contains the following types, which differ in how they interpret the basic notions which I have just mentioned to you. And we will go deep into those notions in a few minutes. So you have, sorry, let me back up. So you have these terms of traditional or strict theism, modified or moderate or qualified theism, revised theism, open theism, and process theology. Now, all of us would fall somewhere within this spectrum. And there are also some other subcategories. And what they mean, I'm going to explain as we discuss these questions. So the first question, let's go straight to the first question. Does God change? And there will be 5 questions. This looks like an academic question, but the answer to it carries significant implications. The first question comes with some additional questions to it. Namely, does God have emotions? Can God be affected by the actions of his creation? And this is also called the question of, as we have on the screen, divine immutability or mutability, and the related questions of divine impassibility or passibility. Now, immutability signifying changelessness, meaning God doesn't change at all, and impassibility signifying that God is not capable to experience emotions and sufferings. Within the contemporary horizon, there are 4 main answers that have been provided to these questions. So let's go through them. Utter immutability and strict impassibility is the first option. Utter immutability means that God doesn't change at all, while strict impassibility, being a subcategory of immutability, means God does not have emotions. He doesn't change, he cannot have emotions, or emotional response either. So utter immutability goes hand in hand with strict impassibility. What this position affirms is what we call pure aseity, meaning God doesn't depend on anything else. He is timeless and simple. His existence is not dependent or influenced by anything else. In this sense, God is not really related to the world, but listen, the world is related to God. On the other end of the spectrum is what we call then ethical immutability and strong essential passibility. That's on the at the end on your screens. This view is of process theism, for example. Such a position has brought to us a view of God who is fully and universally sympathetic. And I leave it for now at that. In a middle position, or middle of the road, I should say, is then something we can call qualified immutability and qualified impassibility. This proposes that God is really related to the world. God is relational, respectively relationally mutable, but not mutable in his essential nature. In other words, God is mutable in relation to the world only, One can call this view as revised impossibility too. Essentially, qualified or revised impossibility criticizes the theology of God, running from Origen to Maimonides to Kant, that God cannot experience joy or sorrow. There is a large number of contemporary scholars who subscribe to this view. Furthermore, under the category, the same middle-of-the-road category, we have something you can call qualified immutability and qualified possibility. Now, in this version, God is immutable, so unchangeable, in his essential nature, yet also voluntarily relational, and hence can change relationally. Therefore, God is not unchangeable in strict sense. Now, what exactly is the difference? We don't have time to discuss between C and D, but they fall roughly under the category of God is immutable, changeless, yet relationally he is willing to change. Now, I will always just stop and give you a bit of a breather after I introduce these questions in the discussion. So here is the breather for you, the first one. So breathe. What already this short discussion demonstrates is that the issues relating even to basic questions concerning God and creation are complex and diverse. It becomes evident that we should not oversimplify the issues, because the question of God includes certain necessary level of complexity without which we may not realize how far we ourselves are influenced by these past and present debates, even though we may have never even heard the strange vocabulary of divine aseity, immutability, or impossibility. The reality is that each of us would fall somewhere into the four categories we mentioned if we were to ask and explain the basic question whether God changes and how he relates to the world. Question 2. Does God exist in time, and is he omnipresent? Once again, the question may appear philosophical or speculative even, yet it carries major consequences with it for our perception of God, and it has been debated for many centuries. The second question introduces the topic of what we may call divine omnipresence and eternity. Theologians also refer to this as divine timelessness or atemporality. The question then leads to the topic of divine omnipresence. Let's go to the answers. Three basic answers have emerged in the Christian theology to these questions. Answer 1 is that of strict theism, which affirms divine timelessness, meaning God exists outside of time. What that means, I will jump over for now. Answer 2 suggests that God is timeless and not timeless. God is somehow both atemporal and temporal, being outside of time and yet entering into time. This is sometimes called temporal omnipresence. One can suggest here that, listen, God is neither temporal, not atemporal in the way creatures are. In other words, God does not experience time as we do. His relation to it is similar to ours, but not the same as ours. In fact, it is very different than ours. In the first case, God's relation to time is only very different from ours. There is the third answer as well here. And this one believes in divine temporality, a position opposite to strict timelessness, the first one. This last answer suggests that God is eternal, yet he also experiences temporal succession. Within this category, process theists and open theists argue in favor of atemporal view, suggesting God experiences time exactly as we do because he's part of it. So in the first instance, very different experience of God with time. In the second, similar to ours, but different. The third, exactly the same as ours. Which one do you believe? And does it matter? Regarding the question of God's presence or omnipresence, meaning God is present everywhere, I will skip this question since the question is veiled in considerable mystery, and if we push this, we really hit simply the limits there. I will just perhaps mention that classical theism, representing most of our confessions and beliefs, affirms divine omnipresence, suggests that God is present at every point in space, yet at the same time denying that God is contained or encompassed by space. And this leads us to question number 3, which is this one. Does God know everything? The debate concerns God's knowledge, and it includes also the question of whether God knows the future. Now, why is it important? Because the question of divine knowledge unearths the significant question of human free will and responsibility. In other words, if we ask the question, does God know future, and answer it with affirmation, then does that mean that we have no free will? Just as in the previous 2 questions, this one was also extensively discussed and debated, and still is. Perhaps as a side note, I just want to clarify that starting from this question, the discussion enters closer to God's character. The first 2 questions were predominantly focused on God's existence, nature, and how he relates to creation. The following 3 questions of divine knowledge, divine omnipresence, and then divine goodness are questions which will deal closer or more directly with the topic of God's character. So, the questions, does God know everything? Does God know the future? Raise complex issues. This is sometimes called also the question of divine omniscience. That is, God being all-knowing. Given the complexity and the depth of the questions, I will categorize the answers into 5 categories. Theistic determinism proposes that God knows everything, and hence it leads to causal determinism. What this means is that humans do not have libertarian free will as the consequence of this answer. However, at the same time, many in this category acknowledge some kind of free will which is not against causal determinism. How is it possible? Well, the limited view of the free will is sometimes called compatibilist free will. You have those terms on the screen. The bottom line of this view is that God knows the future exhaustively and definitely because he has determined the future. Whether he has causally determined everything or he works through secondary causes is secondary. In either case, God knows every decision humans will make. And this position is held by many strict theists and broadly acknowledged by the Augustinian Calvinist tradition. The second answer to whether God knows everything is that of the open theism and process theism, which is the polar extreme to this one. In this view, God knows all there is to know, but not everything. God does not have exhaustive knowledge of events or future, because it would cancel the libertarian freedom of creation. So the second answer is that there is no divine foreknowledge, there is no divine determination in any form, and it also means that the future is open and friends, even uncertain. God may know something about the future, but his knowledge is not exhaustive. For open theism and process theologians, human free will is the key component of reality, and hence the answer to divine knowledge must be one that goes against any form of determinism, even if it means that the future doesn't exist yet even for God. Number of prominent theologians and philosophers have advocated this view in recent decades, among them Clark Pinnock, or, for example, within Adventism, Richard Rice. The third answer, the so-called, in the middle of the road again, the so-called Ockhamist answer. That is an answer, a major clarification from Middle Ages by the famous 14th century English theologian William of Ockham, suggests that God knows everything, so affirms God being all-knowing, including future, yet God's knowing the future does not necessitate it. How can it be? For Ockham, God has evident cognition of all future contingents, that is possibilities. All future possibilities are open before God. And because of that, it renders, respectively, it doesn't render God's foreknowledge necessary, i.e. deterministic. Another version of this is that of Boethius, the so-called Boethian answer, also known as the atemporalist answer. And this has been advocated by some prominent Christian thinkers, such as Boethius, as I mentioned, Anselm, or Aquinas. And this position attempts to reconcile God's exhaustive knowledge with libertarian free will of humans by suggesting that God knows the future directly. How is it possible? Via direct apprehension of the future itself. In other words, God doesn't know beforehand. Rather, all times are eternally present to God, and He experiences all times at the same time. Have you heard this before? Maybe you haven't believed in this before. It's from Boethius. Finally, the Molinist answer. The answer was developed by Luis de Molina, famous 16th century theologian. God knows the future via middle knowledge, he says. So God is omniscient, He knows everything. How does He know it? Through middle knowledge. He knows what creatures might do freely. Essentially, what this answer suggests about divine omniscience and consequently human free will and responsibility is that God possesses kind of hypothetical or middle knowledge, meaning that God knows what humans might do or what they would do in any context. And if God knows such, then He would take that into account in relation to His own decisions. So this view was, for example, held by a well-known Dutch theologian, Arminius. Now, from this overview, and let me give you a breather, because I went for 2 questions without giving you a breathing space. So let's breathe a little bit. From this overview, what we can see is that on the key question, where there was some general consensus in Christianity from the beginning, namely that God is all-knowing, including future, we get to very different explanations of what that actually means when we break it down to the impact on human free will and responsibility. What kind of God is He if He knows everything in deterministic sense? Where does it leave our part of the bargain? What kind of God is He if He does not know everything, not even future? Where does it leave you? Is it possible to trust unconditionally a God who knows everything, including future, in a way that is not deterministic and yet foster dynamic, genuine relationship on our end? What does it do to you if you know that God knows your reaction after the end of this presentation? What does it do to your prayer response to God if you know that God knows whether your loved one will be healed or not, that you'll pass the exam or not, that you do well at the interview or fail the interview? How are you going to pray when you know that God knows what you're going to pray? What does it do to our response to God if we apply to Him the language of omniscience, that He is all-knowing? And we just did in the introduction. Now, I'm spelling out some of these consequences of this question and seemingly putting this to you as if, and I'm sorry to be quite sharp now, as if you had a choice to reject or accept some of the language and options that I told you about God being all-knowing. This is very false of me. And it's a false position what I'm saying, because we don't have the choice. We are thinking, be it perhaps not as sharply as I have put it to you, about consequences of divine omniscience, but we are already thinking and praying and preaching and approaching God from the conviction of God being omniscient. This is the legacy of 2,000 years of Christian dogmatics and its language on us. All right, let's face more of this legacy through question number 4. Question number 4 is this: can God do anything and everything? If the previous question was about divine omniscience, this one is about divine omnipotence, the extent and exercise of divine power. Can God do anything and everything? Does God cause everything? These are the core questions under consideration. If God can do everything, how come there is evil? How come there is suffering to the extent there is? Now, just like in the case of the previous question, its consequences on human free will and responsibility, so the question of divine being almighty, also raises topics of divine providence, and consequently has implications on human free will and responsibility. Thus, divine determinism creeps back again if you ask the question whether God is omnipotent. To make the discussion succinct, scholars suggest that there are three main positions regarding this question. Here they are. Theistic determinism of strict theism argues that God causally determines everything. That's what we heard already with the question of omniscience. Same is the case with the divine omnipotence. Everything in the world is the result of divine determinism. Such position is not compatible with libertarian free will, as we have already seen. However, as in the case of divine omniscience, people try to get around this and say, yeah, we might not have full libertarian free will, but we have at least compatibilist, some sort of free will that works. And so we can be held responsible for our actions. The question of divine responsibility for evil naturally arises. Here, some theistic determinists argue that while God causes all, including evil, such evil is not evil for God, because divine causation is for good purposes. In other words, there is evil, God is responsible for it, but it serves larger purpose. Hence, God is justified in the face of evil. That's how they get around the problem of God determining everything. Theistic determinists argue that their position is the one of Christian orthodoxy, since all the major thinkers of Christian faith subscribe to it, including Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, or Calvin. Now, it may be interesting to note that the last one named suggested that God determines even the thoughts of humans, not only their actions. However, in the face of evil, even some strict theists within this category have a major problem to swallow this explanation as the explanation for divine omnipotence. The second position concerning the question of divine omnipotence is answered in the opposite way as determinism. And this answer suggests that if we claim that God is all-powerful, it means that God has maximal persuasive power. That's on the other end, on your screen. This answer is the polar extreme to the theistic determinism and is held by process theology. The third main answer to the question of divine omnipotence is that God is omnipotent, but grants significant freedom. One can see this as the middle position, sitting between the two answers. In this view, God is omnipotent and could determine everything, yet he does not causally determine it. This is sometimes called sovereignty indeterminism. The proponents of this position believe that this was the earliest position of the Church until the 4th century, which was subsequently followed by Eastern Orthodoxy. Later, most of Western theologians from the time of Duns Scotus in the 14th century, including Melanchthon, Arminius, or Anselm of Canterbury before Scotus in the 12th century. So, with regards to the impact of divine omnipotence on human free will and freedom, while this is a natural consequence of the topic, I'm going to skip this. Because once again, the discussion is complex, and secondly, we already have mentioned the basic positions and those categories. As a way of summary to the fourth main question, I just want to say that even though we provided a high altitude summary of the discussion, it still demonstrates that there is considerable complexity and variations, variability of answers which are involved in answering the very basic confession of Christian faith. Even the basic notion regarding God's attributes and character have been understood in manifold and often contradictory ways. It should therefore not surprise us that the language which they have brought with them is equally complex, and I think you now see it, hardly resembles biblical vocabulary. Which brings us to question number 5, the last question. And it is this one. Is God entirely good? Now, this question is the question of divine omnibenevolence. And once again, it is related to the question of free will. So you just can't escape that issue. Yet the question is also related to the question of, the very basic question of evil. Why is there evil if there is entirely good God? Ultimately, this opens the hotly contested topic of theodicy. There are 8 specific proposals concerning the question of divine omnibenevolence and theodicy which have emerged in the course of Christian history. All we can do here is to fly over them and mention them. So let's go. Deterministic approach suggests God is not the author of evil. Even when God causes evil, he doesn't do it with evil intentions. We have already mentioned the explanation before. So the higher purpose of God justifies God in the face of evil, even though he basically causes evil, because he causes everything. Number 2, skeptical theism is skeptical with regard to the human capacity to understand divine reasons relative to evil. So there is evil, and to what degree God is responsible for it, we cannot say. We know God is entirely good, that's the confession, but this is where we have to stop. Number 3, process theodicy and finitist approaches. These diffuse the problem by denying divine omnipotence, saying God is not omnipotent, and so finitists, for example, argue that God does not possess the power to prevent evil, therefore is not culpable for it. In other words, God is not almighty and he could not prevent evil, hence is not responsible for it. That's also one of the options to explain this. Number 4, protest or anti-theodicy approach suggests that theodicies legitimize evil. So if we try to come up with an explanation for evil justifying God, we are basically legitimizing evil. Some in this group claim God may not be entirely good. From the point of view of Christian theology, this is not a viable option because the vast majority of the Christian believers believe in good God. Number 5, free will defense approaches propose evil is the result of the misuse of creatory free will. So it is an indirect explanation why evil, because of the creation. But it doesn't directly explain, how is it still possible when you have entirely good God? Okay? Number 6, open theism response. God is not culpable because he did not know with certainty what evil will occur. He doesn't know future. He doesn't know everything. As we said before, his knowledge is limited. And hence, he did not know with certainty whether evil will appear and where it will go. Number 7, the so-called felix culpa and the greater good answer, or answers. Maintain evil is necessary for greater good. Hence the name felix culpa, meaning happy fault. And is referring to the fall in the sense it did more good than evil. A position which has, believe it or not, long history going back to Ambrose of Milan, Augustine, Aquinas, or in the 19th century Schleiermacher. And lastly, cosmic conflict approaches provide a free will defense which places the question of evil into celestial framework, so away from the evil we experience here necessarily. While this is predominantly the Adventist model of explanation, the divine omnibenevolence and theodicy, we can also name C.S. Lewis and Kevin Van Hooser as current protagonists of this view. Now, there are then a range of contradictory approaches to the core and very foundational questions of God's goodness and what it means for us. Is God a good being? Entirely good being? The serpent suggested otherwise, and the whole biblical canon and biblical history serves as the revelation to the answer to this question. Christian theology, in the face of evil, still struggles to provide coherent answer, as you can see. Now, where do these questions then and their potential answers leave us? What do they mean for the topic of God's character? So here comes the reflection. Part 2. Critical questions, and I'll just back up a little bit here before I show you that screen. What is looming behind the major diversity of views is what is becoming increasingly acknowledged in theology, and that is that Hellenistic philosophy with their notions dominate divine questions from the very early days of Christian theology. This is called Hellenization hypothesis. The grip of the philosophical notions of God has been so strong that it eclipsed almost fully the biblical language, let alone the narrative form of scriptures through which the topic of God has progressively been unfolded. Now, this is a shocking discovery, because if the doctrine of God is the alpha and the omega of Christian theology, as it has been from the beginning, then at the core of Christian theology is a Trojan horse, which has done significant damage to it. Who we think God is paramount to our response to Him. If we have a skewed version of God, His nature, His character, His interactions with us, we will certainly have a skewed relationship to Him and a skewed theology at large, skewed notions of church governance and leadership and so on. Hellenistic notions of God exercise powerful yet mostly hidden grip on our thinking and reading of the Bible, because we automatically tend to read in the light of our language preconceived notions about God. What is then the Hellenization hypothesis? Essentially, the phrase stands for a change that classical theistic conceptions of divine immutability, impassibility, including timelessness and simplicity, even though I have not covered the question of simplicity, have been shaped by Greek notions. In this regard, it is worth quoting Jürgen Moltmann, an eminent contemporary theologian, who says this: Christian theology acquired Greek philosophy's ways of thinking in the Hellenistic world. And since that time, most theologians have simultaneously maintained the passion of Christ, God's Son, and the deity's essential incapacity for suffering, even though it was at the price of having to talk paradoxically about the suffering of the God who cannot suffer. But in doing this, they have simply added together Greek philosophy's apathy, axiom, and the central statements of the gospel. The contradiction remains unsatisfactory. Indeed, the level of collusion between classical, mainly strict form of theism and Hellenistic philosophy creates unsatisfactory situation. We think and speak of God in mutually contradictory terms, and we even pat ourselves how clever we are in keeping notions like divine transcendence and immanence together and find biblical support for both. Yet the whole conception of divine transcendence is a downright Greek notion assigned to deity, which is far removed from the world and has no interaction with it, because such deity is perfect, simple, timeless, immutable, impassible. Yet this world is fallen, evil, and material, a quality which is incompatible with immaterial and impassionate God. Yet we happily speak and explain God in terms of transcendence and immanence. So transcendence language became the umbrella language capturing a paradigm totally foreign to biblical authors. Yes, for biblical authors, God is totally different from creation, but is never transcendent, friends, removed from it or impassionate towards it. Even people in the camp of classical strict theism nowadays, who are vocal in today's God debate, like Catherine Rogers, concedes that, you have the statement on the screen, when Augustine and later thinkers who were committed to the God of biblical revelation came to approach their faith in the light of Greek thought, the result was what we call the classical God of the philosophers. Who God is matters, and even more the language with which we describe God. We could have had, this is a serious point, we could have had a different systematic theology today if it was not for the influence of Greek language on the foundational Christian doctrine of God. The issue with language, as Wittgenstein reminds us, the issue is with language, as Wittgenstein reminds us. We constantly use in communication different language games, which arise from different worldviews, horizons, and paradigms. To apply this to doctrine of God means that the church came to use a mixed language, which represents, on one hand, biblical worldview, as Moltmann says, and at the same time, Hellenistic paradigm. The result is a mixed bag or language game that creates major tension and effectively eclipses biblical theological investigation on the topic, because the language constantly hijacks us back to non-biblical notions or explanations. Thomas Kuhn's theory of paradigm shift is also helpful to invoke here, since his research demonstrates that paradigms have their own language, method, and worldviews, and once the language is introduced into a different worldview context, represented by a different language game, different notions, the old worldview recedes into the background, yet still keeps exercising its influence in a stealth mode. That's Kuhn's conclusion. What that means is that we cannot use notions of Hellenistic transcendence without silencing their underlying paradigm completely. We may think that we can baptize, to use a more churchly language, Plato and Aristotle and the language into the Christian fold, but they will still believe in a God that is far, far removed from the God of the Bible, as Moltmann or Rogers concede. Marko Lukic's work on Kuhn's theory, which he applied as a framework for understanding Adventist theological innovation of the 19th century, shows that Adventism, from its inception, has attempted to break with this invisible grip of Hellenistic Christianity. He demonstrates, Lukic, that Adventism indeed attempts to be radically different from classical dogmatics. And this gives us some hope that perhaps there could be progress made when it comes to doctrine of God too. I believe that in the work of John Peckham, professor of theology and Christian philosophy at the seminary at Andrews University, we have an example of addressing the Trojan horse issue. Peckham's latest two books, Doctrine of God and Divine Attributes, not only analyze the problem we're facing, but demonstrate that following scriptural canonical framework, it is possible to provide something what he calls a biblical warrant for the doctrine of God. I think in terms of not only Adventist systematic theology, but generally Peckham's contribution is one of the most significant and exciting ones within the field of systematics nowadays. As I have started with an epistemic warning from the book of Job, so I want to return to it. There is a limit to our human attempts to see under the hand of God, either as it relates to God's creation or God's nature or his character. There is a limit how far we can extend our investigation of the natural world, how far our eyes can see even with the help of the best telescopes, and how far our language can reach even with the best help of all the greatest philosophy out there. No matter how cleverly speculative, philosophical, contradictory, sophisticated the language has become or will become, it will always hit a barrier beyond which no philosophy language will help. So my last slide. Ellen White's pedagogical advice to the church becomes almost like a prophetic one when it comes to the subject of God. We have many lessons to learn, but many, many more to unlearn. And let me add about God and his character. I hope this year's Newbold Bible Conference will offer us those perspectives from which we will be able to learn. But at the same time, I hope that with this dense background, we will listen with the spirit that is also ready to unlearn if faced with fresh biblical theological warrant. Thank you for your attention.